Shalom, shalom, friends. Thank you so much for joining today for this really deep and important conversation. Recovery in the Torah, models of spirituality and healing. So incredibly important for all those who are affected or connected to this issue and those who are not yet. Let me tell you about Rabbi Dr. Chaim Tureff, who I'm so glad is here. He endeavors to build human connections and help all people relate to one another. He's the founder of STARS, which guides people struggling with addiction by focusing on the spiritual component through seminars, groups, and one-on-one coaching. He is also the Rav Beit Sefer at Pressman Academy in LA, a spiritual advisor at Soberman's estate in Arizona, a member of the Teachers on Fire Kollel, and a regular contributor to the Jewish press. He's a producer on an upcoming documentary about African Americans and Jewish Americans, and recently wrote a book, Recovery in the Torah, Models of Spirituality and Healing, which he's here to speak about today, which deals with intersection of Torah and addiction recovery. Very much looking forward, Rav Chaim, to learning with you. And with that, I pass it over to you. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. I'm really happy to be here. Very grateful. I wanted just a little overview, just a little overview of how I want to work today. Is I want to share a little bit, looking at the Torah and looking at this idea of recovery, this idea of not just recovery when it comes to substances or other things, but just in general, and looking at it from a point of view, from a Torah point of view, and seeing how we can intersect the two together. So I wanted to just start off with a breathing technique. So somatic breathing, probably many of you, if not all of you, have heard of it before, right? It's just basically intentional breathing, right? And a way to calm our nervous system. There's thousands of different breathing techniques. This is just one that I use when I'm working with clients, when I'm running therapy groups, which I run every week, just a way to kind of start. And so we'll do this one together. If not for you, I'm doing it for me, just to kind of calms the nervous system down. This is one. And again, when it comes to somatic breathing, there are different techniques, and whatever works for the person, is great. So this one is where we're just using, this is nostril breathing. So we'll be breathing in. So you see the numbers here, it's 4-1-8-4. So we'll be breathing into a 4 count, holding for a 1 count, breathing in, breathing out for an 8 count, and then holding for a 4 count. So it's 4-1-8-4. It really, this one specifically is for calming. It works. I can tell you, as Rav Shmuley mentioned, I live in Los Angeles. So when I'm in the car or even when I'm walking, there's craziness that's bound to happen. And this is something, if I'm in the car and in traffic, something that I can just do very quickly, right? To allow myself to kind of calm. When I'm with students, parents, whether my own family, whatever it might be, something that might at the moment kind of get you. These breathing techniques, and this is one you can do. You don't have to lie down. You don't have to be in a quiet environment. You can just kind of do it on your own. So I will call it out. We'll do 3 cycles of it. So again, breathing in, holding, breathing out, holding. So if you want to just take one quick breath, whatever that is for you that's comfortable, and then we will begin. So breathing in, 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold for a 1 count. And then out through the nostrils, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. And then hold for a 4 count. 3, 2, and 1. And then just breathe out. And then we'll do this another time. So breathing in, 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold for a 1 count. And then out, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. And then holding for a 4, 3, 2, and 1. And then we'll do one last time. So breathing in, 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold for a 1 count, and then out, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1, and then holding for a 4, 3, 2, and 1, and then just breathing out. You should, I mean, many times when I'm doing this, depending on what's going on in the moment, I'm able to kind of just, it takes me from whatever I was at down a couple notches and just able to be more in my executive state. So talking about recovery, so looking at when it comes to somebody who's struggling with addiction, I like to look at it as 4 quadrants. There's the mental, emotional, physical, and spiritual, which I wrote mental by accident here, but it is the spiritual. So the way that my focus is on the spiritual component of recovery. So all these components are necessary, right? You need the mental and the emotional. That means you're digging deep, you're looking at your history, therapy, certain things, right? Physical, am I getting enough sleep? Am I eating healthy? Am I taking care of my body? But then there's the spiritual component, which many places that work with people that are struggling with addiction, they tend to forget about that spiritual component. And it is essential when it comes to making sure that somebody is fully in recovery. And there's a place here in Los Angeles that I sometimes teach at. It's called Beit Sefer. It's a Jewish recovery place that people come and they can stay inpatient. And one of the founders, her name was Harriet, she had a famous line, which maybe she did not coin, but I always give her credit because that's where I learned it from, which is everybody's in recovery, meaning we're all recovering from something. Now, whether that is something that's traditional that one might think, alcohol, drugs, food, sex, shopping, internet, whatever it might be, gambling, right? Those things, or in recovery, not necessarily something with addiction, but we all have something that we're trying to work on, whether that's relationships that we have, whether that's our family of origin, whether that is when it comes to work, whether it's certain midot, certain qualities that we have that we're like, I need to work on this, right? So we all have that that we're working on. So hence this idea of everyone being in recovery. So I wrote a book called Recovery in the Torah, and I'm actually going to read from this week's Parsha, Vayera, that I wrote. And the reason that I wrote the book is I was actually working, running a group at a rehab center here in Los Angeles, and it was only with those that were Orthodox, and it was actually Orthodox men. And I wanted to find a way to kind of start each of the group therapy. And so I decided each week to share something about the Parsha and try to tie it into recovery. And they enjoyed it. Hence, my wife said, why don't you write it down? And so I did. So I'm going to read from this week's Parsha, Vayera. And again, the way that I look at it is looking at the Parsha and seeing how can I find something that is connected to recovery in that realm. So as you dip your hand into the bag of chips, for only one chip, it becomes impossible to stop. You can't just stop at one. The one chip becomes 8 chips, which then becomes the entire bag. That was my experience with the cheesy nacho chips I would eat in college. So also when I wrote this, I literally would think of certain things, and that's how I would start. Each parsha is about a page, but I would think of an experience I had. This specifically had to do with I was not keeping kosher at the time, and every night I would buy a bag of Doritos, but not like the 1 ounce bags, the big bags. And I had never actually had Doritos before college, believe it or not. And I was like, these are the greatest things ever. So that's actually what I was thinking of, just for a backdrop. In this week's Parsha, 7 of the 10 plagues that Hashem put on the Egyptians are enumerated. The plague of frogs was a unique plague. According to the Torah, Aaron stretched out his hand over the waters of Egypt, and the frog came up. What is unusual is that if you read further, the entire land of Egypt was covered in frogs. According to the Talmud, one frog came out, and then a swarm followed. According to the Midrash, there was one large frog that came out of the Nile, and the Egyptians kept hitting the frog. More and more and more frogs came from the initial frog. The understanding of this Midrash is that the anger that the Egyptians displayed by striking the frog and then hitting the other frogs gave rise to the swarms of frogs. Anyone in recovery has heard the saying, one is too many and 1,000 is not enough. That initial frog brought the Egyptian anger out. Then once they started hitting the frog and all the subsequent frogs, it was out of control. There were frogs in ovens, beds, rooms, etc. The same is true with an addict. Once there's any room for the addiction to enter, it becomes very difficult to get rid of. The first hit of the substance or action causes a continual desire to continue the actions. Even though the addict sees that their actions are causing chaos, much like the frogs, they don't stop. As a matter of fact, they continue to do the same thing, thinking that they will find relief with the action. But instead of relief, they find pain, suffering, and confusion. This just leads to a vicious cycle. Unlike the frogs, which stopped after a week, the addict's actions can lead to a lifetime of pain. Just as the Egyptians acquiesced and realized that they were powerless over the frogs and allowed for Hashem to intervene, so an addict needs to realize that they are powerless. Once this first step is taken, then they can start on the road to recovery. So one of the spiritual principles, which is not at all unique to recovery whatsoever, is an idea of gratitude. Gratitude playing, really an important part in our lives, right? And there's a lot of Jewish literature, right, on gratitude, on this idea of hakarat hatov. And when it comes to recovery, one of the most important principles is this idea of gratitude, having hakarat hatov and bringing that into one's life. And one who walks in, right, one who walks into a 12-step meeting, for example, and they'll walk in and there'll be 10 people, 50 people, 3 people, 100, whatever it is, whatever that meeting might be that they're walking into. Usually by the time that they leave, if it is their first meeting, they really will experience some sort of gratitude, because many times, especially when somebody comes in for the very first time to a meeting, when they're actually allowing themselves to be vulnerable and to say, I've got a problem and I can't control it and I need some help, they end up leaving with people that don't even know them, never met them before, right? Willing to be there, willing to offer support. So I look at when I'm teaching and when I'm running different seminars, I look at these different spiritual principles, whether it's forgiveness, self-forgiveness, vulnerability, prayer, or gratitude, among other things, and look at it really from an idea of a spiritual principle and how it can help in recovery. So for this in particular, right, looking at it from a Jewish lens. So this first, I brought a couple sources, since this is a Jewish group. And so I brought a few sources that look at this idea of gratitude. So the first one is from Avot de Rabbi Natan, right? It says, if you've done your friend just a little bit of harm, think of it as a lot. And if you've done your friend a lot of good, think of it as a little. If your friend has done you a little bit of good, think of it as a lot. And if they've done you a lot of harm, think of it as a little. Meaning this idea that we focus on the positive, right? We focus on what has happened in a positive sense and less on the negative, right? The brain as we know, scientifically speaking, the brain is pattern seeking, right? So when we focus on more positive things, that's the thing that we're going to think about. And because the way that Hashem created us, we tend to go to the negative. That's just how we go. But we have, right, these grooves in our brain, right, the neurotransmitters, and we're able to rewire ourselves. And the idea of gratitude is seen in, probably many of you have seen this before, it's seen as a practice of gratitude. Much like working out, right? If you've never worked out in your entire life, you're like, okay, I'm going to start working out. I want to get, more physically fit, and I go into the gym, or I'm going to go take a class to get more healthy, right? It doesn't, after one time in the gym or two times or even four or five, right? You don't change automatically. It takes time. It's a practice, right? Right. And so gratitude is no different. It's a practice. It's something that we have to practice within ourselves. And so this source, right, is this idea of focusing on that, right? Noticing the positive. So I want you to just take 2 or 3 minutes just on your own, and you can either write it down, you can think about it, but think about what you're grateful for, meaning 3 people, and why. So I'm going to mute myself just so that there's no noise whatsoever, and just think about 3 people that you're grateful for and why you're grateful for those people. All right. So at some point later today, if you have an opportunity, find one of the people, and if you only did one, find that person and let them know that you're grateful, and let them know what you're grateful for. Right? So when we practice more gratitude, and what we're going to look towards the end, I'll share a little bit where there have been lots of scientific studies when it comes to gratitude and how it impacts us. So the next source is from the Gemara, from Menachot, which is this idea, right, where Rabbi Meir, right, says that we're obligated to recite 100 blessings every day. And he takes it out, he darshans it, he pulls out from this idea, right, where it says, what does God, right, what does God ask of you? What does God require from you, right? And the understanding is that the word in Hebrew, ma and mea, right, ma being what and mea being 100, right, are very close, right? And so he understands this as saying 100 rather than what. That's what God, right? So every day, this idea of saying 100 blessings, which for those of you that daven 3 times a day, right, you can kind of fit it in there, right, when it comes to the davening and saying brachot and so on and so forth. But if one, most of the clients that I work with are not Jewish, right, and so they have a different spiritual practice. So this idea of integrating gratitude into your daily life. So one of the things that I share with them that I happen to do is that every night before I go to bed, either you write a gratitude journal, right, where you write down at least 5 things that you're grateful for that day. Not necessarily people, it can be literally anything. I do it a little differently. I do where I don't write it down, even though I enjoy writing. But it's, for me, I do it after I do Kriya Shema when I go to bed. And so then I will say 15 things that I'm grateful for from that day. And I specifically picked 15 because of the number and one of Hashem's names. And I want to push myself because I realized when I started this practice that I was not inherently a grateful person myself. And so instead, just taking things kind of for granted. Or expectations, which in the recovery world, there's a saying that expectations, right, are resentments waiting to happen. So instead, really looking at each day and finding things that I'm grateful for. What are these things that I am thankful for? And they really can range, right? And it changes the brain. It changes how we see things. So for example, I force myself to add something that I'm grateful for maybe somebody that I take for granted. And what I mean by that is whether that's my wife, right? Because you expect, well, my husband does this, or my wife does this, my partner does this, my brother or sister, right? People that you're very, very close to, sometimes we take for granted what they do for us, right? So I force myself every day to include that as part of my gratitude. And then, I mean, I live in Los Angeles, right? And so living in LA right now, there's a lot to be grateful for. I still have a place to live, right? I personally have not been evacuated, although I know a lot of people that have. I know people that have lost their homes. My family lost part of their home from Hurricane Helene. My family's from Asheville, North Carolina, and it was devastating. So I experienced that firsthand, and yet still grateful for whatever it is, which there's always, right? There are always things that we can express gratitude for, this practice of gratitude. This next one comes from Perkei Avot, right? The famous one, right? Izehu Ashir, who's rich, right? Hasameach, right? Bechelko, who's rich? One that's happy with what they have, right? Ben Zoma said this, right? So this idea that we always, right? In Kohelet Rabbah, it says we always want more. The actual quote from Kohelet Rabbah says that if you have 100, you want 200, right? And that's, some of this is a good thing, right? We desire for certain things that's hence we try to achieve, right? In a positive way, right? We want to grow. If we're not growing, right, that's not a positive thing. And in Judaism, we definitely focus on growing spiritually. So we always want to push ourselves, but happy with what we have, right? Happy in the moment, happy, right? We can always have more, whoever it is, whatever it is that you think considers wealth, right? Whether that's health, whether that's physical things, whether that's family, whatever it is, right? But to be happy with what it is that we have in the moment. There's a saying in the recovery world, right? Don't judge your insides by somebody else's outsides, right? And what it means is this idea of always looking and seeing what other people have and seeing what you don't have, right? So I like to always think of this example, which some of you maybe have heard a couple years ago, 4 or 5 years ago. They were called I think this is the exact name, Facebook family, something like that. And it was this family in Colorado. It was a husband and a wife, and they had 2 daughters. Beautiful home. If you saw their pictures, he was a really handsome man. She was very beautiful. The kids were beautiful. They had this majestic Colorado house in the mountains, and I guess she posted a lot on Facebook and ended up, right, he ended up murdering his wife and 2 daughters because he was having an affair. And whatever you saw on the outside was not really what was going on the inside, right? They were actually destitute. They were way in over their heads. There was obviously there was infidelity and other things going on and abuse. But on the outside, if you just knew them and people that were like, oh, I was their neighbor, they seemed really happy or they seemed really nice. And if you were a Facebook friend of theirs and you were struggling in life, whatever that was for you, and you saw their pictures, you would have possibly been jealous and said, why can't I have that life? Why can't my husband be like that, or my wife, or my children, right? And in reality, we can't judge our insides, right? We all have stuff going on the inside, and we live in a world where we see certain things, but it's not the reality necessarily, right? Again, I live in LA. There's a lot of Hollywood, even not in Hollywood, right? Where people put up certain fronts, and it's a beautiful idea that I'm happy with what I have, and when whatever I'm struggling with on the inside, I'm not comparing that to somebody else, what I think they might have, because I really don't know what's going on. I have no idea what's really going on with them. So here are some scientific things, right? Studies that show when it comes to gratitude, and these things are associated with gratitude. And just imagine if, as I go through these, just imagine there was a pill in the world, right? A pill with no side effects whatsoever, didn't cost anything, right? There was no big pharma involved, but you could take a pill and all these things happened, right? That would be incredible. There would be you couldn't sell it for enough. And yet scientific studies, right? There's the spirit, and I always, when I'm working with those in recovery, I always will point out actually first the science, and then I'll bring in spirituality. With this group, I started with the spirituality, and then bringing in the science. But this idea that there are all these things, these studies that prove, right, that the practice of gratitude can really change who we are and change how we experience things. So one, more optimism and positive emotions, right? Amazing. Better relationships. Everybody loves that. Improved health, right? There's literally in our country, besides there are reasons why the health of our country isn't what it could be, especially for the amount of wealth that we have in our country. But that's a side note. But just, our basic health, right, can be improved when we see things differently, when we have this practice of gratitude, more progress towards personal goals, fewer aches and pains, right? Oh, my knees, my back, my hips, right? All these things which are legitimately people feel. Increased generosity and empathy, better sleep, improved self-esteem, and then overall lasting effects on the brain, right? And so again, when we practice something, whether it's positive or unfortunately negative, right? Speaking of the chips at the beginning and when it comes to addiction, right? The more that we do something, the brain is pattern seeking, right? So the more we do things, the more it then becomes part of what it does, right? That's just how it is. So gratitude, the practice of gratitude, right, breaks that cycle, right? If you're focusing on the negative, it actually also helps when we do act on the practice of gratitude, when we show gratitude towards others, right? When we're doing these things, it actually helps to release serotonin and dopamines within our brain, right? These are the exact things that when you take an antidepressant, for example, it helps with. Sometimes somebody's not getting enough, serotonin, right? Dopamines, right? That's what gambling does, right? That's what pornography does. That's what other drugs do, right? The dopamines, and we get this high rush, right? It's intoxicating, right? Practicing gratitude does not the exact same thing, but also allows the release, right, of the dopamines and the serotonin, and then the neurotransmitters, right, where we had these, whatever it is that we're struggling with, whatever it is that we're in recovery from, right? Then we're starting to kind of make new roads. I always think of when you go out, like in Los Angeles, unfortunately, they don't do it very often, but when they repave the streets. So if you've ever been on a new road and when they repaved it, and at first you're driving and it's like, right, the tires of your car kind of go back and forth, right? And that's the neurotransmitters. And we're developing these new grooves, right? Actually within our own brains. And it changes the way we experience life. It changes the way that we experience things, and it changes the way that we act upon when things happen, right? So again, this idea of when we practice gratitude that we're happier, right? It doesn't mean you're happy all the time, and it doesn't mean that things don't happen. That's not what it's saying. It's saying that you experience it differently, right? And overall, it only breeds positivity, which I think everybody can, be helpful for everyone. And then I just brought one last source. I like this story. Maybe some of you have heard it before or seen it before. Oh, sorry, bring it back. Rabbi Eliyahu Lopian, right, says the Musar teachings. Once he was talking to a student after prayer, and at the same time he was folding up his talit, right? And the talit was large, and he had to rest it on a bench to fold it. After he finished folding it, right? Rabbi Eliyahu noticed that the bench was dusty, so he headed out to grab a towel and to wipe it off. The student who he was speaking to realized what Rabbi Eliyahu was doing, and he ran to get the towel for him. Rabbi Eliyahu held up his hand and said, "No, no, I must clean it myself, for I must show my gratitude to the bench upon which I folded my talit." Right? So this idea, this notion that we have gratitude, right? Here's an inanimate object, a bench, and it's two steps away. It's his talit, right? And he's finished with davening, and not necessarily, right? He's not even talking about the talit that he was wearing. Like, oh, I have gratitude that I have a talit and so on. But like the bench that he was using to fold his talit, to sit down and fold it, right? And so really going above and beyond this idea of gratitude. And so why I brought gratitude today when I'm talking about recovery in the Torah, models of spirituality and healing, is that being able to look when one is struggling with something, and again, here I'm, on the overarching talking about addiction, but for those that don't necessarily resonate with addiction, this idea of overall recovery, right? This idea that within Judaism, right, within looking at each parsha, you can see, and with really so many things, you can see this idea that we have the tools, right? And gratitude being one of those tools, one of those spiritual tools that helps when it comes to connecting, right? So it's not only connecting to our higher power, but it's also connecting to other humans. And when we do that, right, that gives us the ability to then to connect to our higher power. And it helps in the process of healing, whether that's spiritual healing, um, which then helps, right? When we have spiritual healing, then it helps us with all the other quadrants that I brought up at first, right? The mental, the emotional, and the physical, right? It's all interlooped one with the other. It's not just one or the other. I'd love to turn it over to you. If anybody has questions or something came up, whether in the reading or questions overall or anything that kind of went through today.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Tureff. Yes, we would love to take some time. If there are any questions, people can please feel free to raise their hands and I can call on folks to unmute. And you can also write things in the chat if anyone's more comfortable with that. I guess that was a very thorough presentation. No one's gonna, everything was very clear. Thank you so much. I really love the gratitude practices. I know my husband is a physician and he often has to work like night shifts. And so that's something they teach them a lot in their sort of like wellness practices and things like that. And he says it really makes a big difference if you're driving into work at midnight and you're tired and, it's easy to think, oh, I don't want to be here right now. I don't want to do this. And if you change your perspective and start thinking about how grateful you are to have a job and get to help people and, the positive aspects of it, it totally changes his mood going into a shift. So I know from his experience, I know it works.
Yeah, I mean, as you're saying that, it triggered a thought, an example. It's not as life-saving, though my wife might disagree, but for me, washing the dishes, right? So, meaning, at first, probably when we got married, I was not so enthusiastic about washing dishes. And then as I was doing more studying, quite frankly, on gratitude and trying to change the way I see things and experience things, I read something once and it completely shifted, specifically Motzi Shabbos, right? We have guests and we don't use the dishwasher, and the dishwasher is Chaim. And there's pots and there's dishes and there's glasses and there's silverware and there's dirty this and that. And I literally, it changed my perspective. And when I wash dishes, Motzi Shabbos, and in general, but specifically Motzi Shabbos, because that's when there's so many, I'm like, I am so grateful that we had the opportunity to have guests. B, that my wife, because it's mostly her and my children, not me at all, that do the cooking, right? And prepare and all of that. And it's incredible. I didn't need to do that. And it all got done. And that I have water and warm water and soap, and that I can stand and use my hands and I can wash the dishes and I can clean them. And then we can use them again. Like, this is amazing. And I really feel like I literally feel joy now when I wash dishes. And a complete shift of this sucks. I don't want to do that. Like, why do I have to wash the dishes? This is ridiculous. Whatever was going on in my head, I don't know exactly, but I know I was not in love with it. And now I smile and my kids kind of make fun of me. I love it. I'm like, this is great. That I have this opportunity and that I can do it. And so again, it's not life-saving, though I guess my wife might argue with that if I left the dishes till Sunday or Monday, but like a doctor, but this idea of seeing something and shifting the way that we experience it.
I love that. I'm going to have to try that next time I wash dishes. There was a question from Ariel in the chat. Is there a benefit to expressing gratitude towards those you are grateful for, or simply being grateful internally is enough?
I would say expressing gratitude to those, right, to those outside of us is important because there's a certain spirituality and a spiritual connection there when you express to somebody what you're grateful for, and it doesn't actually have to be somebody you know, right? I think back, just an example. Last year, or now it's a year and whatever, there was the march in Washington, the first one. And I remember being in a group, and as it was over, we're walking out, and there were first responders, right? And police and fire. And every time we walked past, and we were like, thank you so much for what you did, and thank you for your service. These gruff men and women were like, had this huge smile on their face, right? And they're like, oh, you're welcome, right? Or when you're in the grocery store. I remember when I grew up in Tennessee and North Carolina. I grew up in the South. So I went to college in New York. And for me, that was a culture shock. And I remember the first time I went to a grocery store, if any of you live in New York or have lived there, there's a place called Wallbaum's. And I walked in and I bought some groceries. I'm 17 years old. I know nothing about New York. And I'm in line and I put my stuff down and I look at the cashier and I said to her, like, how are you today? And I'm smiling because I don't know that in New York, you're not supposed to smile at people and you're not supposed to say hello if you don't know them. And she looked at me, she started to yell at me. She's like, what do you want from me? I'm moving as fast as I can. And she just started like raising her voice. And I was still not jaded enough that I said to her, oh, I'm sorry. I just asked you how you're doing today. And her face went from this anger to, oh, I didn't even hear you. I just heard you saying something. And I assumed that you told me to move faster because that's what everybody does here. So Ariel, I apologize for the long-winded answer. So I think it is important to express it. And I also think it's important, like when I do my gratitude list at night before I go to bed, I don't necessarily go to all of those people to express gratitude. That's the truth. I don't always, but I do verbalize it so that I'm hearing it and it's seeping into my brain, right? And I'm acknowledging it and it's reinforcing. Just like we all have experienced this when we've said negative things about ourselves, right? We're frustrated about something we couldn't accomplish, or we're annoyed that our body isn't able to do what maybe it could have done when we were 11 or 20 or 30, depending on however old people are in this room, right? And when we get frustrated and we say negative things or we beat ourselves up when we make mistakes, it's the same thing with the gratitude. As we're saying it, it's like our brain is actually internalizing it. So my answer would be both. I think they're both important.
Great. Well, thank you again so much for joining us today, Rabbi Tureff, and thank you everyone for being here and learning with us. Thanks to Temple Chai for co-sponsoring today's program. And thanks again, everyone. Have a good day.